The first sign wasn't a lipstick stain or a whisper. It was a scent that didn't belong to my life. It clung to Mark's suit jacket the way fog hangs to river water, expensive powdery something I'd never wear. While he showered, his phone lit up on the dresser, and a banner blinked once before vanishing. Room 412, same time. I stood there with a basket of clean towels pressed to my ribs, hearing only the pulse in my ears and the slick slice of the shower curtain rings. I could have told myself it was a client, a joke, a wrong number, but the perfume and the timing braided together like two truths that refused to let go. When he stepped out, steam followed him into our bedroom, and he kissed my cheek, like always, the gesture practiced almost automatic. I smiled back the way women do when the floor shifts under their feet, and they pretend it's only the house settling. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and if stories like this help you drift off or keep you company on your evening walks. If you've ever felt that split-second wobble in your world, the scent, the message, the silence, tap the like button so more of us can find each other here. And subscribe if you want. Quiet, steady stories where dignity wins in the end. I grew up believing that small things held the world together: folded towels, grocery lists on the fridge, the soft click of a door locked at night. My mother taught third grade for 30 years, and my father fixed cars behind our bungalow, the kind of man who could make a dead engine cough back to life with patience and clean hands. I carried that into my work as a school counselor, showing up early, learning the names that everyone else forgot, keeping a basket of granola bars for the kids who claimed they weren't hungry. By the time I met Mark at a charity 5K, I had learned to listen for steadiness in a person's voice, and his had sounded like gravel smoothed by rain, warm, dependable, not flashy. Mark was the first to notice the worn patch on my running shoe, and the last to cut in when I spoke. It's a small thing, but small things make a life. He sold learning software to districts from Ohio to the Carolinas, spent his weeks in airports and conference rooms, and came home with stories about principals who smelled like coffee and budgets that didn't stretch far enough. We married in a little chapel with creaking pews, then saved for a pale blue colonial on a street lined with sugar maples. Lily was born the fall. Those trees went gold, and I swear her first laugh sounded like wind through leaves. The years stacked up in ordinary ways: birthday candles, oil changes, school photos stuck to the fridge with magnets from places we meant to revisit. When Walter, Mark's father, downsized from his ranch house, he joined us for Sunday dinners, arriving with a toolbox and a bag of oranges, as if both were essential to keeping a family in working order. He approved of our routines and bragged that his son had finally learned to land the plane after all that travel. I liked hearing him talk about the summers he spent framing houses the way wood answered back when the nails were true. He called me the backbone of the house, and I wore the word like a quiet medal. Even Tessa, my old college friend, quick with a laugh and a guest list, had a place at our table. She lived 10 minutes away and made a living turning other people's milestones into evenings. No one forgot arriving with swatches and flower names and a perfume that stuck in a room after the door closed. On the surface, we looked like a postcard, a tidy lawn, a second-hand piano for lily winter coats lined up on hooks by the back door. I drove carpool and learned the rhythm of the school bell from the teacher's side, then from the mother's, and back again. Mark's job got busier as his company grew. The trips stretched longer, the check-ins shorter. Quarter end, he'd say, pecking my temple, setting his suitcase by the doorway like a placeholder for himself. I told myself this was what success looked like: more meetings, nicer suits, tired shoulders at the end of the day. When Tessa landed the contract to plan the district foundation gala, I felt proud in a way I can only call maternal. I'd known her since we shared a bathroom and a borrowed hairdryer. She let me peek at seating charts, gossip about donors' color palettes that photographed well, and I watched her move through rooms like a woman who'd grown up in them. Mark offered to help with sponsor calls, said he knew these people from the education trade shows, and I believed him because it made sense. Because helpful men look so much like good ones when you're tired and grateful. The first crack didn't sound like breaking. It sounded like laughter when I wasn't funny phone calls taken in the hallway. A shower started the second he got home. Lily asked if Dad could make it to her senior night, and he said yes, of course, absolutely, while looking at his calendar, the way a man looks at the weather. He brought home a new suit in a garment bag and told me he'd spilled coffee on the old one, which happens, I suppose, in lives where people move fast and carry too much. But my hands remember fabric. The jacket that came home held a whisper of something that didn't belong to our closet. I didn't confront him right then. Instead, I folded laundry with care that felt like prayer and told myself to wait for daylight, for proof, for the version of the truth that would let me keep breathing in our house. The next morning, when he kissed my cheek and reached for his phone, the screen brightened against the dresser, and a message glided into view like a moth at a window. Room 412. Same time. I didn't gasp, didn't cry, didn't ask who. I let the towel slip from my hands and listened to the distant hum of the neighbor's mower, the ordinary world continuing as if my own had not shifted an inch. I've counseled enough teenagers to know that the first feeling is almost always denial, and the second is a cold, clean kind of awareness, like stepping into a swimming pool at night. All day I walked through meetings with the shape of a hotel key in my mind, an outline that kept sharpening the longer I tried not to see it. After school, I sat in my car with the engine off until my breath lost its tremor, then opened my phone and searched the name of the perfume I'd caught in our bedroom notes of powder, and something sweet, the exact bottle I'd seen once on Tessa's vanity. The search results flickered harmless as any advertisement, and yet I found myself tracing the edges of a possibility I had no right to hold. That night, I set the table and served Walter his stew, listened to Lily's story about a senior prank that involved 24 rubber chickens, and laughed at all the right places, my voice steady, my hands calm. When I cleared the dishes, Mark offered to take out the trash and lingered on the back steps with his phone, the glow painting his jaw like a small private moon. He told me he had an early meeting downtown and would leave before dawn, and I nodded. Said I'd leave the coffee set up so he could just press a button. After everyone went to bed, I wiped the counter twice, then a third time, as if the gleam might answer a question I wasn't brave enough to ask aloud. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't write a note. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway long enough to feel the house settle around me, the way an old friend rests her chin on your shoulder. When the room sank into darkness, I could still see the message on his screen, short and sure of itself. I reached for my keys and found that my hand wasn't shaking anymore. The hotel address waited in my phone like a tiny dare, and when I tapped it, the map opened as though it already knew where I was going. That hotel sat only 20 minutes from our home, but the drive stretched like an hour. Every red light felt deliberate, as though the universe wanted to give me a chance to turn back. The map guided me down a broad avenue lined with brick storefronts, their windows glowing with warm lamplight, and late-night diners sipping coffee. I pulled into the hotel lot and killed the engine, but I stayed inside the car longer than I should have, watching the doors open and close as strangers carried bags and wheeled suitcases across polished tile. My hand lingered on the steering wheel still as stone until a bellman's laugh snapped me forward, and I finally stepped into the lobby. The scent inside struck me first, a blend of citrus and something musky. Not unpleasant, but distinctly impersonal, the kind of smell designed to mask too many comings and goings. A man in a blazer passed with a rolling cart, and I let him go ahead before trailing toward the elevator bank. My reflection in the brass doors startled me. My hair pulled back hastily, my face pale but determined. I pressed the button for the 4th floor, and when the elevator rose, I counted each chime, as though it marked the final beats of an old life. Room 412. was halfway down a long carpeted hall, the number etched in brass on a dark wooden door. I slowed my steps when I reached it, the quiet air humming with the distant sound of an ice machine and muted television chatter through another wall. A woman's laugh drifted faintly from inside, high and familiar, and my chest tightened. I knew that sound, the quick, tinkling laugh that always landed half a beat too soon, as if she wanted to be the first voice heard. It was Tessa. My hand hovered over the door, not to knock, but because my body needed proof that it was real. I didn't open it. Instead, I slid back toward the elevator, my heart hammering loud enough I worried someone else might hear. I didn't need to see them together. The perfume in my closet and the message on his phone had already painted the picture. By the time I returned to my car, my hands trembled against the keys, but I drove home steady, my silence the only witness. The house looked the same as always, porch light glowing, Walter's toolbox still by the garage, Lily's car parked neatly in the driveway. It felt almost cruel how ordinary it looked. The following days unfolded with a careful stillness. I carried on as though nothing had shifted, packing Lily's lunch, attending faculty meetings, chatting with Walter over the Sunday roast. Yet my ears sharpened for every whisper, every unexplained glance at Mark's phone. He grew more attentive in small ways, setting his briefcase down to pour me coffee, asking about my day with forced brightness. If I hadn't seen what I had, I might have believed he was simply making an effort. But beneath each gesture, I heard an echo, a hollowness that no longer fooled me. One evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, the scent of that same perfume brushed against me again. It rose from the cuff of his shirt, faint but undeniable. I held the fabric to my nose, let the reality sink in, and then placed it quietly in the basket. Later that night, as Mark kissed my cheek and reached for his phone again, I kept my face calm. He smiled satisfied and disappeared into the shower. It was then I realized how easily silence could become my ally. Tessa appeared at the house a week later, her arms full of fabric swatches and event invitations. She swept into the kitchen like she had 100 times before, her perfume trailing behind her like a flag, and she spoke quickly, describing the gala's centerpiece design. I smiled and nodded, though every word scraped against me. Mark came in mid-sentence, his eyes flicking from her face to mine, and for the briefest moment, I saw something unguarded in his gaze, guilt or fear. I couldn't be sure. But it was enough. Lily, oblivious, burst through the door with a cheer practice story, and the air shifted back to normal. Tessa laughed in the way she always did, squeezing Lily's shoulder with practiced warmth, and Mark busied himself at the coffee machine. I stood at the counter, listening to the sound of spoons clinking and voices overlapping, and felt a quiet wall rise inside me. The house looked the same, the people sounded the same, but something essential had cracked, and I was the only one willing to acknowledge it. That night, after Lily went upstairs and Walter settled with the evening paper, I stepped out to the porch. The night air was sharp, carrying the faint smell of cut grass from a neighbor's yard. I thought about my parents, about the steadiness of their life, how my father's hands always came home stained with oil, but never with secrets. I wondered what my mother might say if she knew her daughter had just walked past a hotel door and heard her husband's laugh mingled with a friend's. Would she urge me to confront him, or would she tell me to watch, to gather, to wait? I chose to wait. I tucked the knowledge deep, carried it with me like a hidden letter, and moved through my days with a steady face. At school, I guided anxious seniors through their applications. At home, I planned meals and asked Lily about her tests. With Mark, I responded kindly but not naively, listening for what was spoken and unspoken. With Tessa, I smiled, though I noticed how often she dropped by, how her stories lingered a little too long, how her perfume seemed to fill the corners of my home. The first crack had appeared, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I traced it quietly with my eyes, while everyone else went about their routines pretending the surface was still whole. But I knew better. Something hidden had shifted, and sooner or later it would break through where no one could ignore it. The days that followed felt like I was living inside a glass house where every movement echoed louder than it should. Mark carried himself as if nothing had shifted, smiling through dinner and offering to clear the plates, but I caught him slipping his phone into his pocket whenever I entered a room. That gesture, so small and practiced, stung sharper than if he had shouted a lie. Tessa's visits became more frequent too, an excuse about seating arrangements, a question about flower deliveries, a quick stop on her way home. She spoke to me with the same warmth as always, but her eyes flickered when Mark walked in, and I saw him glance away too quickly. At night, when the house settled and Lily's door shut upstairs, I lay awake listening to Mark's breathing beside me. My hand rested on the quilt we'd chosen together years ago, tracing the stitched patterns, but my thoughts ran far from comfort. I had not confronted him, not yet, because part of me was still gathering the courage to face what my heart already knew. Silence became my armor. I answered his questions, smiled when required, and carried on with my routines, but inside, I folded myself smaller, storing away the hurt where no one could touch it. Even Walter noticed a shift. One Saturday morning, he arrived with a bag of oranges and a new wrench, his usual contributions, and lingered a little longer in the kitchen than normal. He tapped the counter with his fingers and finally said, "You look tired, Elena. Everything all right?" I forced a smile, told him work was busy at the school, and busied myself rinsing mugs in the sink. He didn't press, but his eyes followed me with quiet concern, the kind of look a man gives when he recognizes more than he's told. Lily thankfully was wrapped in her senior year. Between cheer practice scholarship applications and her part-time job at the bookstore, she had little time to notice her mother's silences or her father's sudden bursts of forced attentiveness. She asked now and then if we would both be at her events, and Mark always promised his voice too quick, his assurance just a little too eager. She accepted it at face value the way 17-year-olds should, and I was grateful for her innocence even as I felt mine unraveling. One evening after dinner, I carried a basket of folded laundry upstairs and passed by the office. The door stood slightly ajar, and Mark's voice carried into the hall. He spoke low words half hidden, but I caught enough something about next week and could be risky. When he noticed me, he ended the call abruptly and swung the door wider with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Just work," he said, gesturing toward the laptop. I nodded, carrying the basket into the bedroom, but my chest tightened with the certainty that those weren't the words of a man discussing software sales. Later that week, Tessa stopped by again with sample invitations. She spread them across the kitchen table, her perfume curling through the air. Mark leaned over her shoulder, pointing to a gold-embossed script, and they laughed at some detail I wasn't privy to. I stood at the counter, slicing vegetables for dinner, listening to the rhythm of their voices, and felt invisible in my own home. It wasn't the laughter itself that hurt. It was how easily it flowed when they spoke to each other, compared to the measured way he addressed me. That night, when the house was finally quiet, I sat alone in the living room with only the lamp glowing. My eyes traced the photographs on the wall, Lily's kindergarten portrait, the three of us on a beach vacation, Walter holding her as a baby. They stared back at me like fragments of a life that still looked whole to anyone else. I felt tears sting, but did not let them fall. I had grown practiced at swallowing them back before they could betray me. Pain had become a private ritual, something I carried silently while keeping the rest of the family untouched. Even small details began to ache. When Mark returned late from a supposed meeting, he carried the faint scent of cologne that wasn't his usual brand. When Tessa called the house phone and asked for him instead of me, her voice lilted with familiarity. I found myself second-guessing every sound, every word, as though the world had shifted into a language only I understood. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but each time I opened my mouth, the words lodged like stones in my throat. One afternoon, as I left school, I spotted Tessa's car parked outside the same hotel I had driven to weeks before. She stood near the entrance, her phone pressed to her ear, her body angled toward the lobby. She didn't see me, and I didn't let myself be seen. I drove past, hands clenched around the wheel, my pulse racing with confirmation I had never wanted. When I reached home, I sat in the driveway until the sun dipped behind the trees, too numb to step inside. In those days, I became skilled at pretending. To my students, I remained the steady counselor who remembered deadlines and carried tissues in her desk. To Lily, I was the mother who packed lunches and listened to her stories. To Walter, I was the daughter-in-law who welcomed him on Sundays with stew and coffee. And to Mark, I was the wife who smiled just enough to keep suspicion away, though inside, I carried the weight of a truth unspoken. But silence does not erase betrayal. It only deepens the wound. Each night, lying beside the man I once trusted with my whole heart, I felt the distance stretch like a canyon. I wondered how long I could carry it, how long before the cracks I had tried to hide would become impossible to ignore. I knew then that the quiet suffering couldn't last forever. Something was shifting inside me, slow, but certain, like a tide pulling back before the storm. And though I didn't yet know when I sensed the moment was coming, when I would no longer be able to remain silent. The night I saw Tessa's car outside the hotel settled in my mind like a stone at the bottom of a well. I could no longer pretend that what I feared might only be suspicion. The pieces lined up too neatly. The perfume on his clothes, the laughter that cut me out, the messages hidden behind quick gestures. My silence had been my shield, but it had also been a prison, and I felt the bars closing tighter with each passing day. At school, I caught myself staring out the window during student conferences, my pen hovering over forms, while my mind replayed every detail. The students' voices blurred their worries about grades and college essays drifting past me. I had counseled so many children to speak up when something felt wrong, yet I walked my own halls mute. The weight of the contradiction pressed heavy, and I knew I couldn't keep living in that space between truth and denial. At home, the smallest sounds turned into alarms. When Mark's phone buzzed against the counter, my breath caught. When he turned away to take a call in the backyard, my chest tightened. Even Lily's laughter from upstairs, free and innocent, reminded me of what was at stake. She had no idea of the fault lines running through our family, and I wanted to protect her from them. But I also knew she would see the cracks soon enough, and it was better she saw me steady than broken. Walter, too, noticed more than I wished. One evening after dinner, as he dried the dishes I washed, he said quietly, "Something's off here, Elena. You don't have to tell me, but I can feel it." I swallowed hard and kept my eyes on the suds, unwilling to speak, yet unable to deny his intuition. He set a hand on my shoulder before carrying the last plate into the cupboard, his silence saying what his words did not. He knew even without proof. The gala was approaching quickly, and with it came a flurry of planning that seemed designed to keep me off balance. Tessa visited almost daily, her folders spreading across my kitchen table like a second household. She and Mark spoke in half-finished sentences, their ease with each other sharpened by the secrecy I could feel, but not name aloud. I played hostess with a steady smile, pouring coffee, nodding at color choices, but each nod lodged like a splinter in my chest. The night of the gala, I stood before the mirror, adjusting the clasp of my necklace, my reflection unfamiliar to me. Mark came in, adjusting his tie, and asked if I was ready. His voice was calm, casual, but I saw his eyes flicker when he noticed the way my hand lingered at my throat. We drove together, our words light but strained, Lily's laughter echoing behind us as she stayed home with a friend. The city lights blurred past, and I felt as though we were two actors preparing to step onto a stage. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and polished marble, a space designed to dazzle. I walked beside Mark, smiling for acquaintances, shaking hands with donors, all while my heart thudded with the knowledge of what lay beneath. Tessa glided across the room in a gown that caught the light, her hand brushing Mark's arm as they exchanged some quiet remark. To anyone else, it might have seemed nothing. To me, it was confirmation carved in glass. I kept to myself at our table, watching the dance of the evening unfold. Laughter rose, champagne glasses clinked, and the speeches praised dedication and vision. Yet I felt every word bend beneath the weight of what I carried. My eyes found them across the room, leaning toward one another, as though no one else existed. My breath caught, but I forced myself to sit still to listen to see. It was in that stillness that something inside me shifted. The ache that had lived in my chest for weeks began to burn instead, not as sorrow, but as resolve. I realized I could no longer live in the shadow of their choices, tiptoeing around truths that gnawed at me. Whatever came next, I had to face it with open eyes and a steady voice. When we returned home that night, the house felt too quiet, as though it too sensed the turning point. Mark kissed my cheek goodnight, his lips brushing my skin without warmth, and I watched him walk down the hall. I stood in the living room, long after he had gone to bed, the lamplight flickering against the framed photographs, and made a silent vow. I would not be their bystander anymore. The time for silence was closing, and soon I would no longer ignore the truth. The vow I made that night after the gala stayed with me like a steady current beneath every word and gesture. By morning, I knew I could no longer rely on silence alone. If Mark and Tessa wanted to weave their lives in shadows, I would not chase them into the dark. I would bring light into the places they thought safe. I began quietly. The first step was to stop hiding from the truth and to see what was already in front of me. While Mark showered one evening, I slipped his suit jacket from the closet and checked the inner pockets. Receipts crumpled there told me more than his words ever had. A dinner for two at a restaurant downtown, a room charge from the very hotel where I had seen Tessa's car. I placed them carefully back, smoothing the folds, leaving no sign of my search. But inside, I carried their weight like ammunition. At school, my counselor's office became more than a refuge for students. It became a place where I gathered myself, where I kept a folder tucked deep in the bottom drawer, holding copies of what I found. I used the copier after hours, the hum of the machine, a strange comfort as it captured each page. I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet, but I was laying the foundation brick by brick. I spoke little at home, but I listened. When Mark mentioned a late meeting, I noted the time and the way his voice tilted as he said it. When Tessa visited, I noticed the slight shift in their shoulders when they stood too close. I smiled politely, offered coffee, and wrote it all down later in a notebook I kept hidden in my nightstand. My silence was no longer fear, it was strategy. One afternoon, while Lily was at practice and Walter had gone home, I sat in the kitchen with the house still around me. I opened my laptop and began searching property records, following a thought that had lingered since the gala. If their connection ran deeper than stolen moments, it might leave a trail. After an hour of clicking through county documents, I found what I didn't want, but expected Tessa's name alongside Mark's on a business filing a small event partnership registered only months earlier. My chest tightened, but my hands stayed steady as I printed the page and slid it into my folder. That night, Mark came home later than usual, the smell of wine faint on his breath. He leaned down to kiss my cheek, but I kept my face angled just enough that he missed. He didn't comment, didn't push, and walked into the living room to watch television as though nothing hung between us. I carried the image of his signature beside Tessa's in my mind, sharper than any words he might have spoken. The next Sunday dinner with Walter was harder. He watched me more closely than before. His brow creased his fork, pausing midair, as though he wanted to ask something, but didn't. Lily chattered brightly about her upcoming senior night, and I joined her in her laughter, my voice steady, but I could feel Walter's eyes on me. When the evening ended and he stood at the door, he pressed my hand in his, holding it just a moment longer than usual. I understood then that he saw more than I thought, and part of me was grateful for his quiet presence. I knew I couldn't keep collecting forever without acting. One afternoon, I drove to the hotel where I had first seen Tessa's car. My palms were damp against the steering wheel, but I walked through the lobby with a calm face, asking at the desk for information about corporate bookings. The clerk, young and eager to be helpful, provided just enough detail with a few casual questions. There it was again, Mark's name linked to a series of meetings that matched the dates of his supposed late nights at work. I thanked the clerk, my voice even, and walked out with another piece of the puzzle. Back at home, I added the notes to my growing file. The folder was thick now, filled with receipts, records, and printed confirmations. Each page was a piece of a story they thought would stay hidden. I didn't slam doors or cry into pillows. Instead, I sat at the table with a cup of tea and spread the papers in front of me, looking at them like pieces of a map that would lead me out of the cage they had built. Mark noticed the difference, though he didn't understand it. He asked once if everything was all right, his voice carrying more caution than concern. I smiled softly, told him I was fine, and returned to folding laundry. He didn't push, perhaps relieved, perhaps wary. What he didn't realize was that every calm answer, every gentle smile, was another layer of distance I placed between us, giving me the space to prepare. I thought often of Lily during this time, how her world was filled with hopes for the future applications and friendships. I wanted to shield her, but I also knew that the example I set mattered. She needed to see a mother who stood firm, not one who crumbled quietly under betrayal. That thought guided me whenever doubt threatened to unravel my resolve. The house grew quieter in ways Mark didn't recognize. He filled the silence with television and phone calls while I filled it with purpose. The hidden folder under my bed, the notebook in my drawer, the records tucked neatly into a locked cabinet at school. They became my anchors. Each page was proof not only of their betrayal, but also of my strength to face it. One evening, after Mark had gone upstairs, I sat alone in the living room, the lamplight soft on the papers spread before me. My hands moved slowly, arranging them into order, as though preparing a case in court. For the first time in weeks, my chest didn't ache with helplessness. Instead, I felt steady, almost calm. The truth was no longer a shadow. It was something I held in my hands. I gathered the papers, placed them back into the folder, and slid it into its hiding place. Then I stood, turned off the light, and walked upstairs to bed. Mark slept heavily beside me, unaware of the quiet storm building under his own roof. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing that the time for silence was nearing its end. My first steps had been taken, and soon those quiet preparations would rise into something neither he nor Tessa could ignore. The folder of evidence stayed hidden under our bed, but its weight seemed to grow heavier by the day. I carried it with me in every glance, every word, every silence. Mark moved through the house, unaware, humming as he shaved in the morning, flipping through channels at night while I measured each moment against the proof I had collected. The calm mask I wore no longer came from fear, but from readiness. I was preparing for the moment when the walls would close in not around me, but around them. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. The school foundation gala had drawn donors and administrators together. But now the board was planning a follow-up dinner, a smaller gathering at the Whitmore Grand. Harold Kim, the chairman, asked me to help coordinate student speakers. He said it with a kind smile, grateful for my steadiness, and I agreed. What I didn't tell him was that this dinner would give me the stage I needed. Mark would attend as a representative of his company and Tessa as the event planner. They would be there together, standing in the light, believing their secret was still theirs alone. In the days leading up to it, I organized my evidence into a clear sequence. The business filing, the receipts, the hotel confirmations, even photographs of Tessa's car in the lot, all arranged neatly in a binder that looked no different from any other school presentation. I practiced my composure in the mirror, softening my voice, steadying my gaze until the woman looking back at me no longer seemed timid or unsure. She was deliberate, and she was ready. At home, Mark carried on as though our life was intact. He complimented the stew one evening, kissed my cheek with practiced affection, and asked if I would be at the Whitmore dinner. I smiled and told him I would, watching how his shoulders relaxed, how quickly his relief surfaced. He had no idea what awaited him. Even Walter stopping by with his toolbox and oranges sensed the change. He studied me across the kitchen one afternoon, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't press. Perhaps he recognized the quiet strength that had taken root. The evening of the dinner arrived, dressed in rain, the streets slick with reflection as I drove downtown. I carried the binder in a simple leather bag, my hand steady on the handle. Inside the ballroom, the tables gleamed with polished silver, and the hum of polite conversation filled the air. Mark stood near the entrance, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile easy. Beside him, Tessa sparkled in navy satin, her laugh rising above the murmur. My stomach tightened, but I walked toward them calmly, greeting other guests along the way, as though nothing weighed on me. The dinner began with speeches, Harold thanking donors, principals, praising programs, and students sharing their stories. I sat quietly listening, my bag at my feet. When Harold asked me to say a few words as counselor, I rose and spoke about the resilience of our students, about the ways community support carried them forward. My voice was even, my tone warm, and applause rippled through the room when I finished. Then I placed the microphone gently on the podium and reached for the binder. I also want to acknowledge something else tonight, I said, my eyes sweeping across the tables. Our students are taught that integrity matters, that truth matters. And I believe the adults in their lives must model that same standard. My hands opened the binder, revealing the documents inside. I did not raise my voice or dramatize my gestures. I simply laid out the receipts, the filings, the hotel confirmations, sliding them one by one across the podium where every pair of eyes could see. The room shifted, murmurs, rising chairs creaking as people leaned forward. Mark's face drained of color, his lips parting in silent disbelief. Tessa stiffened beside him, her smile collapsing as though it had been built on glass. I did not look directly at them. I looked at the board members, at the teachers, at the donors who prided themselves on supporting education. This partnership, I said, tapping the document with both their signatures, was not disclosed to the board despite its direct link to tonight's event. Transparency is not optional when trust is at stake. The silence that followed was sharper than any outburst. Harold's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he gathered the papers. Around the room, whispers spread, and the carefully staged dinner unraveled. Mark tried to rise, words stammering, but Harold's hand came up to silence him. "We will discuss this privately," he said coldly. Tessa sank into her chair, her face turned away. I gathered my bag and stepped back from the podium, my movements unhurried. I did not need to shout, did not need to accuse. The evidence had spoken, and the weight of it pressed down on them far more forcefully than I ever could. As I walked toward the exit, I felt the eyes of the room follow me, some filled with sympathy, others with shock, but all recognizing the truth of what had just unfolded. Outside, the rain had eased into a mist, the street lamps glowing in its haze. I stood under the awning for a moment, breathing in the damp air, letting the quiet settle into my chest. Inside, the dinner continued in fractured silence, the sheen of elegance stripped away. Mark and Tessa would face the fallout, not in private whispers, but in the full light of the community they had tried to deceive. When I returned home, the house greeted me with stillness. Lily was asleep, her door closed, her world still safe. I slipped off my shoes, set the bag on the counter, and poured myself a glass of water. My reflection in the kitchen window looked steady, composed, nothing like the woman who once lay awake, swallowing back tears. I knew the confrontation was only the beginning. There would be explanations demanded, apologies attempted, and perhaps anger thrown my way. But none of it mattered. The balance had shifted, and for the first time, they were the ones standing in the storm. Upstairs, I slid into bed, the quilt cool against my skin. Mark's side of the bed remained empty that night, and I did not wonder where he was. I closed my eyes with a calm I hadn't felt in months, knowing the breaking point had passed. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight I had given truth its voice. The morning after the Whitmore dinner, the silence in the house was different. It wasn't the ordinary hush of coffee brewing or Lily's footsteps upstairs. It was a hollow space where Mark's presence should have been. His side of the bed remained untouched, the quilt smooth, the pillow still fluffed. I brewed coffee, poured a cup for myself, and left the second mug empty on the counter. It sat there cooling as the minutes stretched on a quiet confirmation that he would not walk through the door with his usual half-smile. By midday, the phone began to ring. The first call was from Harold Kim, his voice firm, almost clipped. He told me that the board had convened immediately after the dinner and decided to sever all ties with Tessa's event company. Sponsorship funds tied to Mark's company were being reviewed as well. He thanked me for bringing the evidence forward, though his tone held more weariness than gratitude. "Trust is fragile," he said before ending the call. His words lingered with me long after the line went dead. Walter appeared at the door, that evening toolbox in one hand, a bag of oranges in the other. He didn't ask permission before setting them down and pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "I've heard things," he said carefully, his eyes steady on mine. It seems the truth caught up faster than I expected. I nodded, unable to find words. For a long moment, we sat together in silence, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock. When I finally spoke, I told him everything about the folder, the receipts, the confrontation. He listened without interruption. His hands folded, his face lined with both sorrow and pride. "You did what you had to," he said finally. "You protected yourself, and you protected Lily. That matters." Lily came home late from a study session, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her smile easy. She noticed the quiet in the house, but said nothing at first, only asked if we could watch a movie together before bed. I agreed, letting her laughter fill the room, grateful for the innocence she still carried. When she leaned against me on the couch, I smoothed her hair back and thought about the storm she didn't yet know. Soon, she would see it for herself. 2 days later, Mark finally returned. He walked in without his briefcase, his tie loose, his shoulders hunched. He stood in the doorway like a man who no longer belonged to the house he had built. I didn't rise to greet him. He cleared his throat and said my name softly, almost pleading. "Elena, please, we need to talk." I met his eyes calm and gestured toward the kitchen table. He sat rubbing his temples, and for the first time in years, I saw him stripped of confidence. I made mistakes. He began, his voice heavy. I let things get out of control. I never meant for it to go this far. His words tumbled, but I sat in silence, waiting. When he mentioned Tessa, his voice broke slightly. He admitted the business filings, the hotel meetings, the affair that had stretched on longer than he cared to detail. He spoke of regret, of wanting to fix what had been broken. I listened until the words ran out and the kitchen fell still. Then I placed my hands on the table, palms open, and told him quietly that regret was not a currency I could accept. Trust, once spent, cannot be bought back with apologies. The fallout spread quickly. Within a week, Mark's company announced his suspension pending an internal review. Tessa's contracts dissolved, her name pulled from upcoming events. I heard through neighbors that she left town for a while, retreating to stay with a cousin in another state. The whispers in the community were sharp, each retelling of the gala growing more pointed, but I did not hide. I walked through the grocery store, greeted colleagues at school, and carried myself with the same calm I had built in silence. It was not shame that followed me, but clarity. One evening, Walter returned, this time without his toolbox. He sat with Lily and me at the table, peeling oranges and passing slices across the plates. Families don't always survive storms, he said gently. But people do. You've shown that. His words steadied me, a reminder that strength wasn't loud. It was quiet, patient, and unyielding. Lily looked between us, her brow furrowed, and finally asked, "Is Dad coming back?" Walter and I exchanged a glance, and I answered softly, "Not in the way you remember." The days grew longer, spring edging in with pale sunlight. But the house remained divided. Mark stayed elsewhere, sometimes sending messages about practical matters, sometimes asking if we could try counseling. I answered briefly, always polite, but never yielding. The door that had closed inside me at the Whitmore dinner did not reopen. I had given him years of trust, and he had broken it with both hands. One Saturday, while sorting through papers at the school, I found the binder again. I had brought it with me months earlier, keeping it locked in my cabinet. I opened it slowly, turning the pages, and realized I no longer needed its weight. The proof had already done its work. Still, I kept it intact, not as a weapon anymore, but as a record of the line I had crossed from silence to strength. That night, as I tucked Lily into bed, she asked if I was all right. Her eyes searched mine, filled with the wisdom of someone on the edge of adulthood. I kissed her forehead and told her the truth. "I am now," I said. And for the first time, the words felt real. The justice I sought wasn't only in their downfall, it was in reclaiming my dignity, in showing my daughter what it meant to stand steady when betrayal tried to pull you under. Mark and Tessa had lost more than reputation. They had lost the chance to ever hold my trust again. I had faced the storm, and though the debris still scattered around us, I was still standing. I knew one final step remained, a closure that went beyond their humiliation. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about setting the course for my life and Lily's, free of shadows and secrets. And as I lay in bed that night, the quiet steady around me, I understood that the final act was close, and it would be mine to right. When the storm finally settled, the house felt different. The air no longer carried the weight of secrets, and the silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Mark stayed away, his presence reduced to short messages about practical matters, and I found that I didn't miss the sound of his key in the door. The chapter we shared had closed, and while its ending was painful, it left me with a steadiness I had never known before. Lily adjusted more quickly than I expected. She kept busy with senior year, but I noticed how her questions grew deeper. She no longer asked if her father was coming back. She asked if I was happy. One night, after we finished painting her bedroom a soft shade of green, she sat cross-legged on the floor and told me, "You look lighter, Mom." I smiled, brushing a streak of paint from her cheek, and realized she was right. The burden I had carried in silence was gone, and in its place was space for both of us to breathe. Walter remained a steady presence, visiting with his bag of oranges, fixing whatever needed attention. He never judged, never pried. He simply offered his company in the quiet way of a man who had lived long enough to know that strength doesn't always announce itself. His trust in me mattered more than I can put into words. It reminded me that even when betrayal cuts deep, loyalty still exists in unexpected places. Tessa faded from our world almost completely. I heard she lost most of her contracts after the Whitmore dinner, her reputation unraveling as quickly as her friendships. Mark, too, faced consequences. His company reassigned his accounts, and though he tried to frame it as a temporary setback, the truth was clear: he had traded integrity for indulgence, and the cost was far greater than he imagined. Watching them stumble wasn't something I celebrated loudly. The satisfaction came quietly in knowing I didn't have to strike back in cruelty. The truth itself was enough. As for me, I built new routines. I took morning walks before school, breathing in the cool air and letting the sound of birdsong fill the spaces where worry once lived. I joined a book club in town, rediscovering the joy of conversation that wasn't laced with suspicion or pretense. Life wasn't perfect, few lives are, but it was honest, and that was more valuable than anything I had lost. Looking back now, I see that justice wasn't about punishing them. It was about reclaiming myself. For years, I had softened my words, tiptoed around insecurities, and silenced my doubts to keep the peace. But peace built on silence isn't real. It's only delay. True peace came when I found the courage to see clearly, to act with dignity, and to choose truth, even when it hurt. To anyone listening who has ever carried betrayal in silence, I will tell you this: you are stronger than you think. Quiet observation is not weakness, and patience is not surrender. Sometimes the most powerful step you can take is to gather your strength in silence and let the truth reveal itself when the time is right. I have scars, yes, but they remind me of what I endured and overcame. I've learned that love should never make you feel small, and trust is not something you beg for. It is something freely given, and once broken, it rarely returns whole. What you can rebuild, though, is yourself. And in that rebuilding, you discover a strength no one can take away. Before we close, I'd love to know, has there ever been a moment in your life when you chose dignity over silence, even when it cost you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.